just while we're on unchosen suffering, and I absolutely accept that the focus of the book is on chosen suffering and the psychology behind that, but you do give an example of the Boston Marathon runner.
Yeah.
As you say, you ran a marathon. Just talk us through that very briefly, because it is a good example of this.
This is this guy, James Costello, the Boston Marathon. Several years ago, there were bombs placed near the finish line, and they went off and killed several people and maimed others. And this guy was seriously burnt and ended up in the hospital for 6 months, whereupon he met a nurse. They fell in love and they got married. And the day they got married, he put it on Facebook. I had wondered why this terrible thing had happened to me, but now I realize that it happened for a purpose. Everything happens for a reason. It happened so I'd meet this woman who would save me and become the love of my life, and so on. And talking about it, I'm close to tearing up. But I think it tells you something not about how the world really works, but about our psychologies. With a graduate student, kind of motivated by this, graduate Koni Banerjee, we did some studies where we asked people to recall the most significant event that happened in the last couple of years, either good or bad. They lost a parent, lost somebody they love, they got married, whatever. And then we asked them a bunch of questions designed to sort of say, did it happen to send you a message? Did it happen for a reason? Was it fate? And we tested both atheists and theists. And as you might have predicted, the theists were much more likely to say things happen for a reason. Religion gives you a ready-made language to do this. But even our atheists often said, to a surprising extent, yeah, it was there to send me a message. Maybe there's nobody sending the message, but still there is a reason for it. I think it's a very powerful human reaction.
Let's come back to chosen suffering, and let's bring religion into the mix. If you take some really extreme examples, as you bring up in the book, you go to the Philippines and you'll find people certain times of the year who literally ask to be nailed to a cross.
Yeah, that's something. They in Mauritius, there's a Hindu festival where they put spears through their face, and then they put hooks onto their body, and then the hooks are attached to a heavy pile of rocks, and you drag the rocks up the hill in the blazing sun. And those are extreme, but all of the major religions, and I bet all of the minor ones, have something like that. They say, you can't eat on those days. Don't eat this food ever. Don't have sex this way ever. There's various forms of deprivations and suffering. And you might wonder, what's the role of this sort of chosen suffering in religion? And there's different ideas. There's sort of two ideas, and I like them both. One idea is that it's a signal. So the people who participate in these grisly festivals are often young men looking for wives. And they're showing off how pious they are and how tough they are. But another theory, which could be compatible, was sort of from Emile Durkheim, which says, these things bring a group together. If you and I suffer together as part of a ritual together, we'll become closer. And there's laboratory work on that. And then finally, there's just one other thing, which is all of this that you see in religious rituals, a stark difference between the chosen and the unchosen. So C.S. Lewis talks a lot about this, and he gives the example of fasting. And he says, to fast in the context of religion could be a glorious event. You're mastering your own body as a sign of devotion to God. But if you're not eating because you ran out of food or you can't afford it, or someone locked you in a room with no food, that's just awful. That's just suffering. And it's very hard to give a meaning to that unchosen part, but maybe too easy to give a meaning to the chosen part. Of course, being C.S. Lewis, he then complained, you shouldn't feel too proud. It takes you away from God.
This isn't entirely unrelated, perhaps, to the difference between solitude and loneliness. If you're on a coach and you're traveling through the wine country on the South Island of New Zealand, and you're on your own and you're on your year off, you're supposed to be on your own at that point. And you've got your Walkman on if it was the late 1990s. And you can revel in that experience of solitude. If you are recently bereaved or you've split up from a girlfriend, then you're not supposed to be alone, or you don't feel like you're supposed to be alone. And that could be very different from any sort of pleasure.
Yes. And we keep making that mistake, and it fails. It often leads us to fail to understand the suffering of others. Donald Rumsfeld, when talking about the mistreatment of prisoners in Guantanamo, he was asked, they make them stand all day. And Rumsfeld says, I have a standing desk. What's the deal? There's a big difference in standing when you want to and standing when someone else makes you to. I'm still on the sort of Iraq war theme. Christopher Hitchens had himself waterboarded to know what it was like. He said, "This is horrible." And I'm sure it is horrible, but it was much more horrible than he experienced, because the thing about real waterboarding is they don't stop when you give them the signal.
And you use the example actually of the tiger who's charging towards you. That's a really bad thing, right? If it's a real tiger and it's really charging towards you, we don't want that. But we can seek out a sort of a sugar-coated version of fear. If we go to one of those ghost trains, or we go to one of those theme parks where you can become involved or immersed in a almost lifelike experience, but where part of your brain knows that you're totally safe. And of course, there's an element of this in gaming, isn't there?
Absolutely, absolutely. All of the emotions we see as negative can become fun and sometimes positive if you strip them from the features that the real world features that they typically resonate to. So fear is negative because fear corresponds to there's trouble. You're going to get eaten by a tiger or whatever. But if you take that away and you're in a haunted house or doing an Oculus Rift virtual reality thing, it could be fun. Even, anger. You get angry. You see something in a movie and it makes you angry. And it's kind of fun. Maybe there's going to be comeuppance at the end or revenge. And you also know nothing really happened. Even sometimes sadness, you kind of feel a mild sadness and nurture it. There's sort of a pleasure in sulking sometimes, as long as you know, again, that the real world stuff isn't that bad.
Yeah, we can feel sorry for ourselves.
Yes.
Feeling sorry for ourselves can be a pleasure, and it can, if it's taken too far and is overly self-indulgent, become a problem. Yes. But I imagine it has a psychological root, because it kind of feels okay to feel sorry for ourselves.
It does, and honestly, there's some evidence that thinking. So when we daydream, to a surprising extent, our daydreams are negative. You might imagine, I got nothing to do, I'm daydreaming. I'll imagine myself winning a big prize or something. But the truth is, just imagine myself winning a big prize. What am I going to do when I win a big prize? I'm going to be happy and say thank you. Where the mind goes is to where it's worth going, which is struggling with bad stuff that might happen. I think this is the tremendous appeal of movies or books where everything goes to hell, no government, no police. And then we're fascinated by this because it's something worth thinking about.
And there's something, isn't there, that can be heroic or impressive in the struggle. You talked a moment ago about the shared experience of sacrifice or of ritual.
Yeah.
And there are those, of course, who believe perhaps that we invented gods to remind us to do ritual, as you say in the book, like putting up a bullseye on a tree in order to remind us to train and practice in our archery with our bows and arrows. And you quote Richard Dawkins at one point in a slightly different context. You say that he says something along the lines of, we're all going to die, we're the lucky ones.
Yeah.
Because think of all those unborn. But I'm just bring Dawkins in to this context because he's recently, I think, or at some point, reevaluated the idea of the handicap theory. He was skeptical of the handicap theory initially, but now he's rather persuaded by it. So it goes something like this. You get a peacock, the male peacock, with his incredible feathers, and it fans the tail. Why is it doing this? Well, the handicap theory suggests that the peacock is showing himself in all his glory, not to show off the colors, but to say, look at me, I've got this incredible burden on my back, and yet I can still mate with you. I can still do all this stuff because look at me, I'm a hero.
Yeah.
So the heroism of suffering, in other words, a little bit.
I like that. I like that idea. I never thought of it that way. I mean, I think the handicap principle is sort of in some way when you see a movie, so you see Brad Pitt dressed up in some way which is ridiculous, and basically he's saying, I can look good, while wearing plaid and a beanie because I am that handsome. And a warning to all the people who would compete with him, you try this, you'll just look like an idiot. But I like the idea of that we sometimes could pile on burdens upon ourselves just to show how we can transcend them. Like you're a chess master and you play without your queen when you're playing me because you can.
When we think of the word masochism, we think of someone who's a masochist because they're deliberately doing nasty stuff to themselves. We might think of sadomasochism,
Yes.
sadomasochism in the sexual context. But walk us through, if you would, the idea of benign masochism, how it works, what it involves, and give us an example.
The term was thought up by Paul Ragen, brilliant psychologist, who first, I think, drew the field's attention to these cases where people harm themselves, but in an everyday sort of way, and it doesn't involve damage to the body. So some examples are eating spicy foods. No other animal willingly eats spicy foods. Dogs in Mexico raised around spicy food will avoid it if they have a chance. Imagine your ankle is sprained. What do? Well, you kind of roll around it. Sore tooth, you poke it with your tongue. Somebody says, you want to look at something disgusting? One answer is, yeah, I do. Roller coaster rides and horror movies and tragedies and sad songs. We seem to seek out physical and emotional pain in the proper levels. And so much, and this is kind of what got me into this, like, what's up with that? And I think there's different things. One of which is, you mentioned Socrates, and Socrates was really smart about the subtle balance between pleasure and pain. Sometimes I think we present ourselves with a bit of pain because the contrast with the pleasure coming later is wonderful. You're in a hot sauna and you jump into a lake in Finland, and the cooling shock. You're eating something really spicy in your mouth and you drink some beer and it cools it off and it feels great. I think that's one thing that goes on. Another thing that goes on is sometimes the right kind of pain could be an escape from self. And I know that sounds kind of hippie and weird and crunchy and everything, but the idea is that when you're sort of, it goes back to what we were talking about before, that sometimes your head is all full of your worries and your regrets and your self-image. And then you engage in some sort of activity like rigorous exercise or bang your hand against a wall or BDSM. And one thing that does is it clears the head. It does for the rest of us what real expert meditators say mindfulness meditation does for them, which is it dissolves the self. And having the self go away is really something.
We talked earlier about effort and reward. This can have a physical manifestation. So if we've climbed a mountain and we get home, we tend to think of ourselves as feeling tired or exhausted in a good way.
Yes.
And that's a very different experience from being shattered at the end of a really stressful experience or a really hard day at work that you didn't particularly enjoy. Putting ourselves through physical challenges can create psychological reward, but we can actually feel it. We like the heaviness of our limbs because the heaviness of our limbs almost embodies that sense of achievement.
That's a great way of putting it. There's a sort of phenomenology of a satisfactory bout of effort. I talk about running, the marathon very poorly, and at the end, my heart's pounding and I'm sweating and I'm feel like I'm going to die, and it felt wonderful. Well, if I'm doing it now as I'm talking to you, I'd feel like I'm having a heart attack and it'd be horrible. There's such a feeling of working out or doing something satisfying and having your body ache, as opposed to you have a blinding headache because you stood the wrong way on a subway back home and and it was incredibly noisy. I even think there's kind of a difference between the feeling after you've been in a flow state for like an hour, I don't know, me talking to you, doing a difficult crossword puzzle, rock climbing, whatever, versus spending an hour sitting on your phone in a kind of a trance, going by YouTube videos or doing Twitter, which I spent way too much time on in my life, which is the satisfying one feels at the end, you feel energized. You can do a lot of stuff. The other one, you just feel kind of gross. So at some level, our experiences are titrated to whether or not what we're doing is internally rewarding or not.
We need to talk about catharsis. So if we go to watch King Lear, and we see Gloucester's eyes being poked out, and we see King Lear's misery as he gives up his kingdom too soon, and we watch the physical manifestation of that, the phenomenology, the sort of physical analogy of him going naked in the storm.
Yeah.
We are being taken on this immense psychological journey, and we are suffering with him, except we're not really suffering ourselves. And through that process, there is a sort of catharsis. We almost are cleansed,
yeah,
without having real harm happen to us, without actually having given up our own kingdoms. Talk to us just a little bit about catharsis in the context of this pleasure and pain matrix.
So there's a very sort of specific, narrow meaning of catharsis that I think most people in my business are very skeptical of. And this is that you go to a horror movie or you see a terrific Shakespearean tragedy, and through weeping or through shaking with fear, you're then cleansed and feel pure. And actually, it turns out that isn't exactly what happens. People leave horror movies jittery. They leave tragedies a little bit weepy. It's not clear that we have the cleansing. But the broader phenomena, which you're getting at, that there's a satisfaction to this, is very real. And I think this is something only fiction can do, because fiction can engage us in real world struggles of importance and magnitude. But in a sense, they aren't real world. And so we're safe. We're insulated against them. Now,
another example of that might be, and for me, this is almost the very definition of the sweet spot, or certainly a very good example of it. If I go back to my parents' place in the middle of Wales, in the middle of nowhere, where you can't see, well, you can just about see another house on the hillside. If I'm on my own in that house, I probably am not going to, I don't like horror movies anyway, but I'm probably not going to seek out a particularly scary thriller, right?
Right.
But if I'm with my dad or if I'm with my girlfriend, I might, because it will scare me just enough, but not too much.
You asked before, are we conscious of these many appetites we have beyond pleasure? And this is a case where we are. I think most people, by the time they reach the age you and I are, but probably much younger, know how to titrate things. We know how much we can take. I like horror movies, but I tend to like kind of more artsy horror movies and less extreme gore and torture. I have friends of mine who go all the way up to 11 on that, and they can take it. One way to think about the difference is an idea of porousness. So basically, you could imagine a world where what's real stays real and what's imaginary stays imaginary. But if it was strictly that, we wouldn't get much pleasure from these things. You have to get scared to enjoy a horror movie. People who watch pornography have to get aroused. You have to somehow treat it as if it was real. But if you treat it too much as if it was real, you're alone in this house in the middle of the woods and you can't sleep that night. You know, you got to kind of put it at the right level. The ability grows. My day job is a developmental psychologist, and you don't take, a 5-year-old to see Nightmare on Elm Street, because there the reality and the fiction blend together too much. As you get older, you get more and more abilities to shield it off.
We've skirted around altruism in this conversation, and altruism can involve sacrifice. And the idea of altruism is we're doing something that is really genuinely for someone else and not for ourselves. And yet, of course, we can take great pleasure in altruism because it makes us feel good. Can you expand a little bit on our basic understanding of altruism?
I think there's a view that there's no such thing as altruism. We're all ultimately selfish and so on. I think that's nonsense. There's now tremendous evidence from baby studies, developmental studies, cross-cultural research that we've evolved self-interest, absolutely, but we've also evolved an interest in the welfare of others, particularly those close to us, for sort of standard Darwinian reasons, our children, our people we interact with, but it could extend even broader. And altruism is part of our nature, limited at times, sometimes inadequate. And it's not entirely a change of topic from pleasure, because one way we've been wired up to be good is that feeling good does give us a buzz sometimes. I think good is its own motivation, but I wouldn't deny that there's some kick to it. There's a very, very simple study that Elizabeth Dunn and her colleagues did, which was you give somebody at the beginning of the day $20, And half of the people are said, spend it on yourself. And half of the people are told, spend it on somebody else. You bring them back at the end of the day. The people who spent it on other people are happier. There's something to that.